Hello everyone, thank you for joining me again and welcome to any new viewers. This is To The Point English with Ben. I'm Ben. Now, when learning a second language, we tend to focus on areas like grammar, vocabulary and pronunciation, but we sometimes overlook punctuation. And that's a mistake because whether you're planning on taking an English exam or you need to write emails or reports for your work, or maybe you just like writing stories, punctuation is important because a badly punctuated text is not only difficult to read, but it can sometimes be confusing. And you can take my word for that because I've corrected hundreds of writing compositions for students who are preparing for the Cambridge English exams. And when I say punctuation, what I'm really referring to is the comma, because I assume you all know how to use a full stop or an exclamation mark or a question mark. But the comma can be quite tricky. So in this video, I'm going to share the 4 rules for comma use, which in my observations, many students get wrong. Now, there are more rules, but what I'm focusing on today is the most common mistakes that I've noticed students make with a comma. Now, I know many of you are preparing for a Cambridge English exam, and you'll probably notice that punctuation is not one of the 4 marking criteria the examiners specifically look at when marking the writing compositions for the exams, but it is evaluated in the organisation criterion, so the examiners will be looking for good punctuation. So let's look at the first mistake that students commonly make, and it's with non-defining relative clauses. Now, this is not the video to go into detail about the grammar. We're focusing on how to use the comma here, but I will briefly explain the difference between a defining relative clause and a non-defining relative clause. And I go into a lot more detail about clauses in general. It's one of the modules in my grammar course, my essential online grammar course. But let's look at this first of all. So non-defining relative clauses. These are relative clauses with non-essential information. So anytime you write a sentence with a relative clause which contains non-essential information, you should include commas in that sentence. And these relative clauses will be used with the relative pronouns who, which, whose, and whom. Okay, so let's look at an example sentence. The book, which was written in the late 1940s, captures the spirit of post-war Britain. So this is from a book review, and as you can see in the middle there's a relative clause which was written in the late 1940s. So this is extra information. This is non-essential information. And there are the commas. I circled them in case you couldn't see them, but you have to put 1 comma before the relative clause and 1 comma after the relative clause. It's that simple. Let's look at another example. The employees who have threatened to go on strike are demanding better working conditions in the factory. So again, the relative clause there is who have threatened to go on strike. Now, I like to call these non-defining relative clauses by the way clauses. Because they're extra information, we could say, for example, the book, oh, by the way, which was written in the late 1940s, captures the spirit of post-war Britain. Or the employees, oh, by the way, who have threatened to go on strike, are demanding better working conditions. Now, of course, you wouldn't say that or write that in the text, but that's kind of the idea, right? It's the extra information. Because you could delete those clauses and the sentences would still make sense. They would have the same meaning, just with less information. So the book captures the spirit of post-war Britain, and the employees are demanding better working conditions in the factory. So those are complete sentences. With or without the non-defining relative clause, they make sense. But let's look at these 2 sentences. They look pretty much identical, right? Well, they are, except that the first sentence contains the commas and the second one doesn't. So both of these sentences are grammatically correct and make perfect sense. But the first one contains a non-defining relative clause and the second one contains a defining relative clause. So that second sentence would be read differently. There would be no pause when we read it. So the employees who have threatened to go on strike are demanding better working conditions in the factory. But the most important difference is that the relative clause is defining who the employees are. So it's essential information for this sentence. It's a different sentence. So that second sentence, the employees who have threatened to go on strike, only the employees who have threatened to go on strike, not the other employees. There are other employees who have not threatened to go on strike. but the employees who have threatened to go on strike are demanding better working conditions in the factory. In the first sentence, it's perhaps all the employees, by the way, who have threatened to go on strike are demanding better working conditions in the factory. So you have to ask yourself when you're writing these types of sentences, does this clause contain essential information in this sentence? Is it a defining clause or a non-defining clause? If it's a non-defining relative clause, then you need to add the commas. And another common mistake is when students don't use a comma to separate independent clauses. We need commas to separate independent clauses in compound sentences when we use coordinating conjunctions for, and, nor, but, or, yet, and so. If you want to try to remember them, you can use the acronym fanboys, but to be honest, you'll probably never be tested on those, but it's good to remember them. So let's look at a couple of examples. So Jenny didn't like the meal. She didn't want to upset her mother-in-law. So these are two sentences, right? They're independent clauses because they are two different sentences. But if you want to link these sentences, you can use a coordinating conjunction and a comma. So Jenny didn't like the meal, comma, but she didn't want to upset her mother-in-law. But another example, productivity has been declining in recent months. Measures need to be taken. So how would you link those two sentences? What coordinating conjunction would you use, and where would you put the comma? Well, this is how I've linked it. Productivity has been declining in recent months, so measures need to be taken. So comma, so measures need to be taken. Now, if you make this type of mistake once or twice in your text in the Cambridge English exams, for example, you may not be penalized. The examiner may be a little bit flexible, but if you continuously make mistakes with the commas or punctuation in general, you will lose marks. So it's worth just making the effort. And apart from that, I think when the examiners see good use of the comma, it really makes a good impression and they're more likely to give you a higher mark. Another really important use of the comma is after an introductory word or phrase. So we must use a comma after an introductory word or phrase. So what do I mean by that? Well, again, it's not that complicated, but let's look at some examples. So, however, the final decision should be taken by blah, blah, blah. So you need a comma after however. Again, it forces the reader to pause, which is necessary. So, however, the final decision should be taken by. Without the comma, I would read this in a very different way. However, the final decision should be taken by. It doesn't flow in the right way without the comma, and it just looks bad. Some more introductory words. Furthermore, the second text emphasizes. Furthermore is an introductory word. In conclusion, an introductory phrase, a very common phrase to use in essays. But sometimes the introductory phrase is quite long. And that's usually where students make mistakes, when it's a long introductory phrase and they forget to use the comma. So in this case, taking the aforementioned points into consideration, it is believed that the most appropriate course of action is to blah, blah, blah. So again, that's not that complicated, is it? But when you're in an exam context and you're thinking about the time, you're thinking about trying to use some nice grammatical structures, a nice wide range of advanced vocabulary, you're thinking about your spelling, it's easy to forget about the comma. Even though you perhaps know these rules, you need to remind yourself occasionally. So let's look at the last one, and this is everybody's favorite, conditional sentences. So conditional sentences, in this case, you must use a comma when the if clause precedes the main clause, and only when the if clause precedes the main clause. This is an example of a third conditional sentence. So if you'd taken Ben's online preparation course, you would have passed the exam. Yeah, sorry about that example, but you'll forgive me. So if you'd taken Ben's online preparation course, comma, so this is the if clause, and then you would have passed the main exam, that's the main clause. So you need the comma between the if clause and the main clause when the if clause precedes the main clause, but not when the main clause precedes the if clause. So you would have passed the exam if you'd taken Ben's online preparation course. No comma needed there. And of course, that rule applies to all conditional sentences, whether it's the first conditional, second, third, mixed type 1, mixed type 2, and whether you actually use the word if in the sentence or not. You'll have the if clause, but maybe you'll use an alternative to if in the sentence, but it's still the same rule for punctuation. Okay, start practicing. The next time you write an essay or a report, a proposal, a letter, whatever, think about how you use the commas and double check, because it's easy to make mistakes. Okay, I'll see you very soon for another video.